It's night. You're standing on an open plain somewhere in what is now Germany, and it is 40,000 years ago. There is no fire near you right now. There is no roof, no wall, no blanket. Just your skin, air moving at just above freezing, body that is losing heat faster than it can make it. Within 20 minutes, your fingers stop responding the way you want them to. Within an hour, your body starts pulling blood away from your skin and limbs to protect your organs. Start shaking, not because you're scared, but because your muscles are trying to generate heat the only way they know how. If this goes on long enough, your brain starts making bad decisions, because a cold brain is a slow, foggy brain. This is not a hypothetical. This is what happens to an unclothed human body in a cold climate, and for a surprisingly long stretch of our species' history, this is exactly the position we were in. This matters because you are, in fact, wearing clothes right now. Statistically, unless you're in a very specific kind of spa or a very specific kind of beach, you are covered in fabric as you watch this. It's so automatic that you probably haven't thought about it since you got dressed this morning. But somewhere in our past, a group of hairless, exposed primates had to solve this problem from scratch, with no template to copy. And the solution they landed on didn't just keep them warm. It rewired how humans relate to their own bodies, to each other, and to status. A wiring you're still running today. Here's the assumption most people carry into this topic without even realizing it. Humans lost their fur, felt cold and naked, and invented clothes soon after, mostly to cover up modesty and stay warm. Simple story, feels obvious. It's also almost certainly wrong, and the gap between losing fur and inventing clothes is a lot stranger and a lot longer than that story suggests. Let's start with the fur. Humans are unusual among mammals in how little body hair we have. Most researchers who study this point to something around 1 to 3 million years ago as the window when our ancestors began losing dense body hair. And the reason almost certainly wasn't fashion or comfort. It was running. Our ancestors were shifting toward a hunting strategy built on endurance. Not explosive speed, but the ability to chase prey animals across open, hot terrain for hours, until the animal overheated and collapsed while the human was still moving. To pull that off, body needed an extremely efficient cooling system. Thick fur traps heat. Bare skin covered in sweat glands, on the other hand, lets heat evaporate off the surface efficiently. So natural selection favored bodies that could dump heat fast. Less hair, more sweat glands, skin exposed directly to moving air. That's step one. Losing the fur was a heat management upgrade for a very specific survival strategy. Hunting in the heat. But here's the problem that created. Fur wasn't just there to trap heat during exercise. It was also passive insulation for every hour humans weren't running. At night. In colder seasons. In colder places. Once you strip that away, you've solved the overheating problem and created a freezing problem. You've created it everywhere your ancestors weren't standing under direct equatorial sun. So for a long stretch of time, plausibly hundreds of thousands of years, early humans were walking around with bodies optimized for shedding heat in a world that didn't always offer heat to shed. That gap is the actual starting point of the clothing story. Not modesty, thermal engineering that solved one problem and quietly created another. Now here's where the myth really falls apart. If you assume clothing showed up right after fur loss out of obvious necessity, the timeline should be close together. It isn't. Genetic evidence, and we'll get to exactly what kind in a moment, suggests actual clothing likely didn't appear until somewhere in the range of 170,000 years ago, give or take a wide margin scientists still argue about. That means there could have been well over 1 million years where hairless humans were dealing with cold exposure using nothing but behavior. No sewn garments, no woven fiber, just fire, shelter, huddling, probably loosely draped animal hides used more like blankets than clothing. That's an uncomfortably long gap, and it tells you clothing wasn't some automatic, obvious next step. It was a technology that had to be invented, refined, only then normalized, the same way fire, tools, and language were technologies, not instincts. So how do we even know when clothing started, if cloth and hide don't survive in the fossil record for that long? This is the mid-video fact worth sitting with, because it's one of the strangest pieces of evidence in all of human origins research, and it doesn't come from a cave or a bone pit. It comes from lice. Human head lice are ancient parasites that live in scalp hair and have been with our ancestors for millions of years. But there's a second species, body lice, that doesn't live on skin or in head hair at all. It lives in clothing. It clings to fabric seams, lays eggs in fibers, and only visits skin briefly to feed. Body lice cannot survive without garments to live in. No clothes, No body lice. Full stop. Researchers realized that if body lice are a distinct species that evolved specifically to exploit clothing as a habitat, you can use the genetic divergence between head lice and body lice, how much their DNA has drifted apart, as a molecular clock. The point where body lice split off as their own lineage is, roughly, the point where humans started wearing clothes regularly enough for a parasite to evolve a whole new lifestyle around it. Multiple independent studies using this method have landed in a range clustering around 170,000 years ago, with some estimates pushing that number in either direction. An insect that most people consider disgusting turned out to be one of the more reliable clocks we have for a piece of technology that left behind zero physical evidence. That's the kind of fact that sounds made up and isn't. Here's the honest caveat, because this isn't fully settled. Some researchers argue the divergence estimate could be off by tens of thousands of years in either direction, since lice evolve at variable rates and the genetic models involved carry real uncertainty. Others point out that loosely wrapped hides may have been in use well before true tailored clothing. The lice data might be capturing a later refinement rather than the true starting point. Scientists still debate exactly where the line is between occasionally draping an animal skin over your shoulders and wearing clothes in the way we'd recognize it. This isn't a settled date carved in stone. It's the best estimate we have from a genuinely clever piece of detective work, not a confirmed fact stamped and filed away. What we can say with more confidence is the why now question, and this is where the mechanism chain gets interesting. That clothing timeline lines up strikingly well with something else that was happening around the same period. Humans were expanding out of the warmer regions of Africa and into colder, more variable climates, eventually pushing into Ice Age Europe and Asia. A hairless body that worked fine near the equator was a serious liability in a place where winter temperatures could sit well below freezing for months at a time. So the chain looks something like this. Losing fur solved an overheating problem tied to endurance hunting. That created a cold exposure vulnerability. That vulnerability became a hard limit on where humans could actually live and survive. And clothing, real, constructed, layered clothing, not just a hide thrown over a shoulder, was the technology that broke that limit. Didn't just keep people comfortable. It functioned as portable climate. Wearing insulated, tailored clothing meant a human body could carry its own microclimate with it into places its bare skin was never built for. There's supporting evidence for this beyond the lice, too. Archaeologists have found bone needles with eyelets, the kind used for actual sewing, not just draping, dating back tens of thousands of years, found at sites in colder regions associated with populations that were pushing into genuinely harsh environments. Soon, layered clothing appears to track almost exactly with the populations that need it to survive real cold, which is a pretty strong signal that this wasn't a random cultural quirk. It was closer to a survival requirement that happened to also become cultural. And that's the second half of the mechanism chain, the part that's easy to miss. Clothing started as thermal technology, but the moment it existed, it stopped being just thermal technology, because now humans had a new surface to work with. A layer between the body and the world that could be decorated, dyed, cut, and shaped. Once that layer existed, it almost immediately started carrying information. Which animal a hide came from, how much effort went into decorating it, what group you belonged to, what role you held. This is the part that should sound familiar, because it's the same mechanism still running your closet right now. A winter coat still does the literal job clothing was invented for, keeping your skin warmer than the air around it. But the specific coat you chose, the brand on it, the cut, whether it looks expensive or deliberately worn in, none of that is about temperature anymore. It's the same signaling layer early humans built on top of the survival layer, just running on modern fabric instead of modern hide. You are, in a very real sense, still wearing a status marker your ancestors invented as an accessory to not freezing to death. There's a dry irony in that, honestly. A species evolved a cooling system so efficient it made itself vulnerable to the cold, invented a fix for that vulnerability, and then spent the next 100,000+ years using that fix mostly to impress each other. Ever felt genuinely cold at a formal event because the outfit that worked wasn't actually the warm one? Congratulations, you've personally reenacted the entire arc of this technology in a single evening. It's worth being precise about what clothing did and didn't cause, because it's tempting to overstate this. Clothing almost certainly wasn't the single reason humans could migrate into cold climates. Controlled fire, constructed shelter, Group cooperation, we're all doing heavy lifting alongside it. Clothing is better understood as one critical piece in a survival toolkit, not a standalone solution. Overselling it as the thing that let humans conquer the Ice Age would be the kind of tidy, clickable claim that doesn't hold up once you look at the full picture. The honest version is messier. Clothing mattered enormously, but it mattered as part of a system, not as a lone hero. Now, back to modesty, because that's usually where people expect this story to start, and it's worth explaining why it probably doesn't. The idea that clothing began because early humans felt shame about nudity puts the psychological reaction before the physical object. And most of the evidence runs the other way. Shame around nudity looks less like the reason clothing was invented and more like a cultural attitude that developed after clothing already existed and had become the norm. Once covering the body was normal, uncovered could start to feel unusual, exposed, or marked. But that's a downstream social effect, not the original engineering problem. The garment came first. The feeling about not having one came later, and it came because the garment had already changed what normal looked like. That's worth sitting with for a second, an entire emotional response. Modesty, embarrassment, the instinct to cover up appears to be something clothing produced in us, rather than something that produced clothing. The tool reshaped the psychology of the species that built it. That's not a small effect for something that started as a solution to a temperature problem. So let's go back to where we started. You're on that open plain 40,000 years ago, and the cold is doing exactly what cold does to bare, unprotected skin. Somewhere in the deep background of that scene, a version of this problem had already been solved by people not too different from you. People who took the hides of the animals they hunted, learned to cut and shape and stitch them, and built a portable layer of warmth that let their bodies survive conditions their skin alone never could. We didn't invent clothes to hide our bodies. We invented them to survive without fur, and everything else clothing has come to mean the status, the identity. The way an outfit can make you feel like a different version of yourself got layered on top of that original, unglamorous engineering problem afterward. Strip away the fashion, the branding, entire multi-billion-dollar industry built around what you're wearing right now, and underneath all of it is still that same freezing plane, and a hairless primate who figured out how to carry warmth with them wherever they went. You're not wearing an outfit. You're wearing the oldest workaround our species ever built for a problem it created for itself.